This is Russell Roots, Community Outreach Manager with the Utah Film Center, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's discussion after the film of Citizen Ashe. Such a wonderful documentary about a man who did some really wonderful things in the world of sports and civil rights and AIDS activism. So this evening, we've got some distinguished guests with us from Westminster College. I'll start off by introducing them. We have Bree Anderson. Bree is an alumnus of Westminster College. She holds an undergraduate degree in economics and a master's degree in clinical and mental health counseling. Bree played volleyball for the Griffins from 04 to 07 and was lucky enough to be on the first team to go to the Nationals. After graduation, she worked in finance for several years before changing directions and buying out a volleyball club to pursue coaching. Bree returned to Westminster's athletic department, where she was the assistant coach for strength and conditioning, then moved to the head coach position after a year. Bree currently works as a director of compliance for the athletic department, does therapy part-time, and is a board member for the Needs Beyond Medicine. Thank you for joining us tonight, Bree. Flore Elliott is an undergrad junior at Westminster College. She's from Oregon and has spent years playing sports since the age of 3. Sports-wise, she has played volleyball, ridden BMX, and currently runs track. She's currently studying chemistry and loves reading and reality television. Thank you for joining us, Flore. And Victoire, last but not least. Victoire Soumano is an international student from Mali, currently in her 3rd year studying geology at Westminster College. Previously, she has done track, basketball, and soccer. She enjoys outdoor activities and reading. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and kind of open it up. We'll start off with a general conversation. The story of Arthur Ashe gives us a unique look at the civil rights struggle that took place within tennis. What lessons have you learned from watching his experiences? And I'll start with Bree.
Thank you, Russell. So I think Arthur Ashe is a really interesting story. I think it's one of the stories that is probably not as well known as some other African-American individuals that probably really started a movement in sports. I find it really interesting because Arthur Ashe seemed to be really poised and really methodical in what he did, but it was really interesting to kind of see his progression as he went through the film and how people treated him depending on if he was winning, if it was new, and how people viewed him while he was playing tennis compared to when he was off of the court. And so I think that that's something that is probably really relevant today as well with athletes of color, that you can kind of see how people treat them differently when they're playing a sport and it's for entertainment, and then compared to who they are as a person when they're kind of off camera or when they're not in the spotlight, and how people really try to make them 2 different people instead of one person. So you can kind of see that dynamic in that role as you watch Ashe's story and how he had to kind of juggle those 2 to really bring in, to really help that civil rights movement, to really help, people of color in tennis, and to also really show just a really great human being that he was. And that's a lot of balls to juggle for one individual that essentially set the stage for many people going forward.
I highly agree. I think, again, he's a very exceptional individual. He was in a very, very interesting place in that time, particularly with a sport that was extremely rigid. Tennis is not, one of the most lenient sports out there. So he definitely had a story to tell, and he told it exquisitely. Victoire, what did Arthur Ashe's lessons mean for you?
For me, it was really interesting to have kind of a peek in the past and look what it was like to be an activist and an athlete back then, and what it's like today, and especially in different type of sports. The film mentioned how it was kind of more acceptable for people like Muhammad Ali, or in more traditionally Black sports, or where Black people were accepted to be activists and speak their minds. Meanwhile, it was kind of a different story for Arthur Ashe in a more predominantly white sport, where technically he wasn't really accepted as a person of color. And it was really interesting to see the contrast between how when you're in a space you're supposed to occupy, it's okay to speak your mind, but when you're in a space where you're not supposed to occupy, speaking your mind is kind of a different story. So that's kind of the main thing that I was like, oh, that's interesting to see the contrast.
Yeah, that's a wonderful observation. And I think, again, it's about that positionality within a sport, or your perceived positionality within a certain type of sport. that really leads to your acceptance in certain regards. Flore, what were your thoughts with Arthur Ashe?
Um, I thought it was really interesting to see how like a Black person's position in sports, not like it almost hasn't changed since he was playing tennis. Like sure, sports have become more like integrated, and we have a lot more Black athletes like in tennis and other sports, but how he wasn't able, like Victoire is saying, he wasn't really able to speak up as much in tennis. And nowadays, like we have activists like Colin Kaepernick, like it's it's still not as accepted, I would say. I'm surprised that it still isn't, even though it happened back then. So yeah, that's that's kind of what I've been thinking about.
And that's a very interesting thought, which kind of leads me to something that was in the film that I think is still challenging today. That gender issues is still something that has not advanced far enough either, and that was definitely something that was tackled in the film. Victoire, you had some interesting thoughts on that. Do you mind sharing those with us?
Yeah, I was kind of taken aback by when they mentioned how his view on women in sports changed after he met a specific person. And I thought, like, why did it take someone close to you? Why did it take falling in love with someone to be able to like value women in sport? And interesting to see how even up to these days, women's sport is not as important in people's eyes as men's sport, especially in like the NBA versus the women's NBA, for example, and in soccer. And in many different sports, you see women are still kind of like, oh yeah, it's women, so it's like kind of secondhand. And though Arthur Ashe was a really great person and his story is inspiring, there is still yes, it was the time where women were still kind of taken as like second, and I'm like, yes, I forgot that was a thing back then. And so it was just kind of a snap, hey, this is the reality back then, and this is still kind of the reality today. And that was kind of a downer a little bit to think about.
I would agree. I would agree. Very well said. Bree, do you have any thoughts on it?
I think that's one of those dynamics where, right, it kind of brings out a highlight of, we're talking about racism, but we're also talking about gender issues and people and how we can deflect on other issues. And it's really interesting because as a female, I have people tell me how things are all the time. But people get really offended when I'm like, well, as a woman of color, and as soon as you point out that people are doing microaggressions or stereotyping, they're doing a lot of things that makes people really uncomfortable when you point those out. And it kind of has set the stage where people are supposed to stay in their role. And as soon as they step outside of that role, it makes it really uncomfortable. And once again, as a female and then a female of color, you get placed in this category and we step outside of it. And so while Arthur Ashe was in this box and it was really hard for him, I love that it was also pointed out that there are still people that are below him that we're not even having that conversation about. But I do love how the film was able to highlight that, because it starts another conversation about other things that we're missing when we're focused on one issue, and that issue is only a part of the problem as a whole. So I think it really helps to kind of keep that conversation rolling and recognize, problems within problems, even though we're trying to be better.
Agreed. A literal definition of intersectionality, unfortunately. Flore, I saw you nodding your head. What are your thoughts?
When Victoire was talking about women in sports, I just couldn't help but think of how like underappreciated and represented women are in sports these days, and still like not fully accepted, and like women being too good at sports makes people uncomfortable and people thinking that they shouldn't be able to compete. But for some reason, like a man like Usain Bolt can win and win and win and win. But then a woman like Simone Biles, people are like, she's winning too much. Oh no. Like, I think it's really interesting how they treat men winning in sports. Like they think men can win all the time. sure, yeah, they can. A woman starts winning a lot, like, wait, that's confusing, you know, like, why doesn't she have competition? Because she's good. Like, so I think that just when Victoire is talking about just women in sports and how it just hasn't really changed, I was just like, yes, I totally agree.
Agreed, and something that we still need to address, still more work to do. I want to take a moment to address the audience for a second. We're going through our questions here this evening, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have out there. I certainly can ask the questions. If you've got some questions for us, please send them our way, and we'd be happy to address them and give you an opportunity to have a place at the table as well. So hopefully you'll take us up on that and send some our way. We're looking forward to that, and we'll get to those towards the end of the discussion. Now, each of you is from a different background. You're coming from some different places, all of you with a unique set of experiences. I do want to kind of check in with that. What are your thoughts on the current role of civil rights advocacy in sports in regards to basically your personal background, the things you've seen? Where do you think it needs to go from here? Ooh, let me ask someone in particular. Let's start off with Victoire.
That's a really good question. I think the current role of civil rights advocacy is super important, especially for athletes of color. Again, as you mentioned, as we were talking about in the previous question, intersectionality for like Black women, women of color, men of color, Black men. I feel like we need advocacy for them because most of the time they do not have the voice that they need to speak up. And if they speak up, it can like, I want to say threaten. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it can like compromise their position as athletes and their relationship with their teammates, relationship with their coaches and everything. So I do think it is very important to have a crowd of people of color behind them, standing up for the rights, standing up to fight for equality among athletes of color and white athletes. And so everyone should be treated the same way, despite the color of the skin in sports, because that's another aspect of life where racism and other inequalities seep into, and we usually don't look at it that way.
Flore, your thoughts?
I definitely think that it needs to be a constant conversation, and it just needs to be constantly be talked about. Like Victoire is saying, some people don't have not like the power. Everybody has the power to talk about civil rights, but like they don't have kind of like, I'd say, the backup. Like we need everybody talking about it, not just people of color. We want people of color to bring up the conversation, I think, and then we want other people outside of like our race or gender or whatever I think we need like that backup. Because a lot of people, whenever they speak up, everybody's like, oh, they're just making it about race. Oh my gosh, blah, 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 blah. It's like all the Black people are just talking about how, like, boo them. But I feel like we need to bring in the power of the other athletes in the sports to be like, to recognize and tell them like, yeah, they can be mad about this, you know, like, I don't feel like that there's a lot of like camaraderie or just like support, I think. And I think like anybody who decides to speak out in sports is instantly shut down because they don't have somebody behind them saying, I'm not even in this class and I completely agree with what they're saying. And so I think like with civil rights in sports, we need to bring everybody in so we can just keep pushing the conversation so nobody can ignore it. You know, it can't just be the Black people complaining, you know, it is, you know, but like we need other people behind us to help push that forward and kind of put that in people's faces so they can start understanding that like it affects us and there are people who believe in us and who believe what we're trying to like fight for.
Well said. Well said. Now, Bree, you're just a touch older than Victoire and Flore. You've had an experience, that's a smidge, experience with coaching and a longer track record in sports. I really love your thoughts on this.
So this is kind of one of those conversations that I actually have a physical reaction to. And I probably, mostly because I think sorry, I'm trying to articulate this in a good way. But one of the things that I have found in my experience, so I am half Black, half white, and sometimes I'm very racially ambiguous. And I grew up in a very white community, and most of my family is white. And so they view me very differently than if I was in another community. And they say things to me that probably they would never say to one of you three, right, that are on the screen, because we look very different. And it's always interesting because I think that when people are so far removed from a community, they tend to, they don't understand it, but then they stereotype so much. And so one of the things that I've really found is that people tend to really they really like athletes as entertainment. And it's almost as if, I know this isn't new, but when you actually hear them about, it's like athletes are built for, Black athletes are built for entertainment. They're always, the token Black person. I've always been the token Black person, which is once again hilarious because I'm only half, but I'm the best they've got right now. But really it's about their entertainment. We want them to make our teams win. They hold so much value if I'm getting something entertaining out of it as well. And so as soon as they speak out about civil rights, a lot of people tend to really default because they're uncomfortable and they're saying, well, actually, they need to know their place. They're going to school. So it's like you get an education and it's a big deal that you got to go to college. When you're a professional athlete, you're making millions of dollars, that should be enough. And it's almost like we dehumanize them because of their athletic ability and what they're able to do. The other thing, and so as soon as we start talking about civil rights and talking about basic rights, people get that really confused with, your athletic ability, and that should be enough, without really recognizing that we're putting all of their value based off of a skill that they have rather than who they are as a human being. And it makes people really uncomfortable when you talk outside of athletics. And all of a sudden it's like, we can't talk about outside of athletics and if they've ever been harassed because of their skin color, because that makes us really uncomfortable. And those are kind of the things that I see that I feel are really uncomfortable. And unfortunately, Flore kind of pointed this out, is that the people that are advocating are the ones that have their hands tied. And so it's not, right, the Black person shouldn't be the person, or the person of color that's educating everybody and they're shaking their heads. They need other people to actually get on board with that and understand the ramifications, when you're off of the court or the field.
Very well said. Very well said. I think much too much work to be done there. But, as we, again, go back to Colin Kaepernick and a few other examples, it's just this is something that we're still trying to get our heads around, and making some, I think at best we can say, uneven progress towards getting someplace better. Victoire or Flore, do you want to follow up with additional thoughts on that?
Yes, I was just about to snap to what you were saying, because I've had that experience a couple of years ago. I was the only Black person on my basketball team, and our coach was white, and it was a predominantly white school. And so during one of our games, an incident happened, and it was clearly a microaggression from the ref. And so I was very pissed. And so my coach put me on the bench because I wouldn't calm down about it. And so later on, I went to her to talk about it. I was like, you do realize that was definitely racist from the ref, and this is not okay. And I don't feel supported by my team, and I don't feel supported by you as my coach. And she did not want to address it. And she was like, well, you're playing sports, you need to deal with it. And so her response was pretty much, you're an athlete. What you do is suck it up and go on. And that was very frustrating and made me feel kind of removed from the team for the rest of the year. And so and for the rest of the year, I had to be the token Black kid, or I needed to pretend that what was happening wasn't happening if I wanted to keep playing. And that was just when Bree was mentioning about being the token Black kid, and kind of your team or your coaches not really addressing these racist or microaggressions. I felt that on a different level.
Flore?
I agree. Bree brought up I was thinking like athletes are seen like as entertainment, but it's like athlete first, person second. And especially when you're like an athlete of color, it's like you were your sport, you were the face of your sport, you were like that athlete. But it doesn't mean that we don't experience like racism or anything like anybody else. And so when we say that's not right, people are like, whoa, 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 calm down. Like you're not talking about your sport. Like that's your only job. Like, and like Bree was saying, like, isn't making money enough? And I'm like, no, like I should be able to advocate for some like decent like civil rights within my sport. I should be able to advocate for what I want because I'm also human, and like people can advocate for civil rights in the workplace because they like that's their life. Sports is my life. I can advocate for civil rights in the part of my life. So I think it's very interesting that people like treat us kind of just like the sport, like we are the sport, and then kind of forget that like we're human and we can experience other emotions and other issues as well. It's not funny, but I laugh a little bit. But I just wanted to like just bring that up and be like, you like you're making a really good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point because all of these points really kind of get to, and I think Bree and Flore specifically, the labor aspect of sports, which I think is something that's super interesting because they got into it in the film about you know Arthur was a player and then Arthur became a coach. And when Arthur became a coach, he had to deal with the labor aspect of sports, being kind of a manager or in charge in a different way, which I think was a really interesting moment. But I mean, it is, as much as sports is this thing of entertainment and civil rights, it's also a labor issue. And Bree, I think you're probably in a unique position to maybe tell us a little bit more about that. Do you have some thoughts?
Compliance is a lot of labor. If we're speaking specifically about people of color, there. Sorry, I always have to gather my thoughts to make sure I'm articulating what I want and not repeating myself a ton. But especially when the conference that we're at, there's not a lot of diversity. I'll just throw that out there. And because I think there's a big lack of cultural understanding. I have seen a lot of schools too, that when they bring in people of color, there is a huge cultural barrier. And what tends to happen is you have 2 or 3 people of color that come in, and you have a very predominantly white culture, which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what tends to happen is they have to fit that mold, and they kind of get pushed out. And so you're always trying to navigate like the coaching aspect of recruiting, and then the aspect of keeping them in here, and they tend to be especially Black males, if they are human and make errors, they it's very catastrophized and sorry, my dog ran by, but catastrophized, and there's this underlying expectation that they're going to do something that's inappropriate or that it's wrong. And so you're really navigating trying to help them work through these cultural barriers and these stereotypes, and also trying to represent people that are like them, right? And once again, that's why I'm one of the few people of color that's in the athletic department, like probably maybe one of 2. And so I'm representing a whole group of people, but I don't have the cultural experience that they do. So trying to navigate that and manage that and make them feel comfortable and make them feel accepted, and trying to teach people that there is cultural differences and that's normal and that's okay. It's a lot to kind of put that together. And I think there are just a lot of barriers that prevent that from being organic, in my opinion. And that's not a knock on programs. I just think it's a lot of ignorance and understanding on how to bridge that gap when there are very few representatives and there's not a lot of knowledge on how to approach and how to support people that are different than yourself.
Very true. Very true. Well said. Very well said. Victoire, Flore, do y'all have anything to add on to that before we move on a bit? No? Okay. To the audience at home, we're getting ready to move towards the end of the discussion. I just wanted to check in again and see if any of you have any questions. If anything we've said this evening has spurred you to want to speak up, now's your moment. We're getting ready to head to the last question, and we'll be winding things down shortly thereafter. But if you've got something on your mind, now's the time to say it. We're looking forward to hearing from you. So we're going to move to our last question. And it's probably a little bit derivative of what we've been discussing all evening, but really, I just want to ask specifically, how do you see sports changing in the future along the lines of what we've been discussing this evening? And I'll start with Flore.
That's such a hard question to answer. I think I see sports changing for good, of course. I think in sports, we've already seen this just a little bit, but I think we're giving, like, sports will change in the future by giving athletes kind of the power to demand what they want because of how much we demand from them. Just like Allison Felix with Nike, not getting maternity leave, like that's a given right for anybody else who has baby, but she was an athlete. I think in the future, there's so many more like hurdles to go over. There's so many layers to just civil rights within sports that we have to get through. So I'm not saying it's going to like stop, like we're not going to fix it all. But I think we're going to start seeing just more and more activism in sports. And I think it's going to be good to keep that conversation just going and making sure that athletes are treated as human within their sport. I don't know, I'm excited to see how sports will change. I'm excited to kind of see as I continue my athletic journey and see what comes my way as an athlete, and then post athletic journey just as a spectator. But yeah.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you go there as well. Best of luck on that journey. Victoire.
I see the future moving toward positively, because looking back, we've come a long way to where we are today. And I think with our generation being more vocal about race issues, I do have hope about where it's going and about more freedom of speech among athletes and about more support for athletes and civil rights seeping into sports. So I am pretty optimistic and hopeful. I do think it's going to be more on the slower side of things, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take a lot of work. But overall, I do think the future looks brighter than it does right now for athletes.
Good. And last but not least, Bree.
I think this is a great question. And I think you have to be optimistic about change, because that's essentially what is always happening, right? I agree that I think it's going to be slow, but that might also be just because we're impatient. But as a baby boomer over here, I actually really, really love this younger generation that's coming in and is speaking up, and they're not afraid to do it. And right, all of us old people up here are like, oh, in our day, we did it this way. And these younger generation, they're always doing it wrong. But I think these younger generations are really have an opportunity to use their platforms and to use social media. And we don't even have to have the big name athletes doing it. There are so many athletes that we would call second or third tier that do so much good outside of just their sport. And we have a platform to share information. We have platforms now that when wrongdoings happen, it's caught on camera and people have to be held accountable. And so while social media can be a real big downer, it's like this, we're connected with a bunch of people that we're not even in the same room with, and we can have this discussion and we can watch this movie, and it can be really life-changing. And as everybody leaves, sorry about that, as everybody leaves, they will be able to make a difference somehow going forward. And so I think that it'll happen and it will continue to happen, but I think we'll see it at a faster pace now as these athletes are coming out and they're really being able to vocalize things that people didn't have access to before, and they're actually really able to put it out there. And I love that you have, I don't know if anybody saw this, I'm a big Jazz basketball fan, but there was Jordan Clarkson, fashion icon in the NBA, but there was a kid who was white, but he dressed up like Jordan Clarkson, had the cornrows, had tattoos and everything. And people came out and were just like, oh my gosh, appropriation. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but Jordan Clarkson was so excited. And we had this conversation about how great was it that this kid's hero is a person of color, is a Black man. And he is like, he's representing him and he's so grateful. And he's like proud to be that person. And I don't think that could have happened, that couldn't have happened before. But now we have these kids and other people that are emulating these men and women of color, and they're getting behind them, even if it's not at the pace we want. But I do think that people are really starting to rally and are starting to use their voices, and people can't sit in the back anymore. So it's been really great because you can't just sit on the sidelines anymore. And companies and schools and other people
Thank you. So that's the end of our discussion. I would like to say thank you again to Bree, Victoire, and Flore for giving their thoughts this evening. And I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. And hopefully you'll be joining us again next week for our film and post-film discussion for Attica. Again, this is Russell Bruce with Community Outreach with Utah Film Center. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.